With that, I will turn it over to Lisa Smith, Executive Director of WSMA, a tremendous partner and leader for small businesses across our whole state. Lisa?
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne, for this opportunity and for the opportunity to be in the second week. It means we get to exercise our muscle a lot. And today I am just incredibly thrilled to have John McNamara here from the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. And we're going to talk about employee ownership models, including cooperatives and employee stock ownership plans. But I want to just begin by saying this is not fringe work. This is not fringe economic development. This is mainstream, even though I don't think we have really placed as much energy and commitment and investment into these models as we could. And so I want to just say that I am beyond thrilled that our state is like the top in the nation for legislation that supports employee ownership models. And we have the state expert on the call today. We also have Linda Womack at the Department of Commerce, who's the lead staff, doing all of this work and working with the commission. And so I just want to invite you to just open your minds to the power of cooperatives they're all over the place in your community, like REI, like credit unions. I have a painting company that painted our house and they were incredible. And, one of the things they said was, the reason why we will never go back to the other model is because they share the burden of marketing and work. They share decision-making, they share problem solving, and they share the wealth. These are all business owners, but they're owning in a cooperative way. So, okay, sorry, I'm sounding a little bit like an evangelist. Without further ado, I want to introduce John McNamara with the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. Okay, I am an evangelist. All right, I'll let it go.
That's wonderful. Yes, hello everyone. I think some of you have probably heard me talk before on this, and I have a short presentation, and then really I might go through a little bit quick to allow for questions. I'm also in the chat going to put some documents in from a national group that we work with, the Democracy at Work Institute, and their project, the Worker to Owners Collaborative. It's just some guides and things that you can bring for your own work later. And then I'll share my screen and presentation. I should say, in addition to being co-executor of the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, which serves Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, I'm also vice chair of the Washington Employee Ownership Commission and co-chair of the new Washington Center for Employee Ownership, which is based out of the Botkin Foundation in Bellingham. And it's really exciting work. It's a really exciting time to be doing work in employee ownership, especially in Washington, but as I'll mention even nationally. One of the newer developments was a few weeks ago, there was a White House meeting on employee ownership, which is the first time ever for employee ownership to be given that status for a day-long presentation and discussion. So today I'm going to really focus on what's happening in Washington and a little bit on how the national work is affecting us. Yeah, this is just about me, I guess. A real quick introduction for those of you who haven't met me. I have a master's in co-op management and a PhD in business administration from the Sobey School of Business in Halifax. And then prior to coming to the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, I spent 26 years with Union Cab of Madison Cooperative, which was the second largest taxi cab company in Wisconsin, at least when I left, which was right before Uber. They survived Uber, which almost none of the other cab companies in Madison, Wisconsin did. And they're still chugging along. And then finally, I mentioned my commission roles, and I'm also instructor now in the master's program where I graduated from. So what is employee ownership? I like to say it can be as broad as the Puget Sound and as narrow as Kennedy Creek. It kind of depends what you're talking about. The broad definition is where just employees have an ownership stake in the company. So this broad definition could include Google, Amazon, Microsoft, because they get stock options as part of their compensation. That's a little too broad for me. The most narrow definition would be only employees have ownership or have most ownership of the company. In terms of Washington law, the new law for Washington defines it as essentially where no one has, one person has the most shares or control over an organization. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And where employees are actually have ownership. Also, to qualify, as I'll talk about for some of the benefits, employees have to have a majority of the board seats if there are non-employee members of the co-op. So employee ownership can take on a lot of different forms. There's employee stock. Well, we'll get to that in a second. First, one of the newer forms of employee ownership is called an employee-owned trust. This is a perpetual trust, so employees generally don't have a lot of voice in the organization. It tends to run as a very traditional company, but it's a trust, and so the employees are the benefits of the trust, and they have some governance rights, but they definitely have financial rights. The trust, obviously, because of its structure, is not going to be sold to a private, venture capital firm, so it is going to exist in perpetuity to benefit the workers. The best example in Washington right now is the new Home Care Workers Purpose Trust. This is part of a national group of consumer direct care network. So nationally, I think they represent 38,000 caregivers. 90% of these are employees are women's and disproportionately people of color. In Washington, the home care that was done through Apple Care, very often the workers were independent operators who were contracting with the state to provide care, and then represented through the SEIU, Service Employees International Union. They came together to create a trust. This moved people out of that independent contractor status to give them protections as employees. So, for those of you who know, there's a big difference. If you're an independent contractor, you generally don't have access to unemployment. You may have limited access to workers' compensation. There's a number of other situations. Plus, you pay a self-employment tax of 15%. So it can be really difficult, especially if you're working in a field that is not very well paid or doesn't have necessarily full-time hours. It can be really a pathway to poverty, even though you're technically self-employed. So employee-owned trust is one level. There's, like I said, only one or two of them in Washington. Nationally, they're becoming a little bit more common, especially in areas such as home care. The employee stock ownership plan is probably the best known. Most people, when they hear employee ownership, they'll probably think of that. Piggly Wiggly is kind of, or Winco, I think Piggly Wiggly too, Bob's Red Mill, those are some big names right now. Winco's famous for having its millionaire cashiers. What ESOPs are is they really are a retirement plan as opposed to being its own type of organization, and we're having a discussion about that right now on the commission, because you don't really convert to an ESOP, you adopt an ESOP on top of whatever role you already have. So the way it works is part of the compensation for workers is diverted into this plan, which is a retirement plan. A trustee controls those shares, and the trustee has to act in the best interest of the plan. So the trustee doesn't necessarily act in the best interest of the current workers. They're acting in the interest of the vested interests of the future retirees. And so sometimes there can still be quite a bit of voice in the organization, but generally speaking, the trustee acts on that, and can even, and in some cases has, nationally vote to sell the business out from under the workers if it benefits the plan. And the workers usually get a pretty big payday out of it, but nevertheless, it's just an example where it's one of these really tricky things, and there's a lot of ways of running ESOPs. Right now, one of the big one here, I think in Washington, is Schweitzer Engineering. They were also one of the folks that were really supportive of the new law, and Joy Nestegard is chair of the Washington Employee Ownership Commission. So I serve with him. So co-ops, I'm going to just start with co-ops first. A cooperative is also a business. It's actually, most people don't realize this. A cooperative is technically under the IRS structure, a C corporation. So a lot of people think of co-ops as nonprofits, and while they can operate on a not-for-profit basis, they are legally under the IRS a C corp. But what they are is a C corp that is based on specific values, ethics, and principles, which I won't go through all of this. Some of the key ones being that it's one member, one vote, and that when there is a profit, the co-op can either retain that profit and pay corporate taxes on it, or it can pass through that profit to its members based on use of the cooperative. And so they're international. Almost every country has them, has cooperatives. They represent, cooperative membership represents approximately 1/8 of the population on the planet. And most, it's very common for some of the bigger companies in household names that you hear of, like Nationwide Insurance, Welch's, Ocean Spray Cranberry, Land O'Lakes Butter, Dairy Gold, are actually cooperative businesses, not investor-owned businesses. And the difference again being is that they're operating along these values and principles, and they're operating for their members' benefit, not necessarily just to maximize dividends for shareholders. So these are, yeah, some examples. Ace Hardware is actually, and Thriftway, I always like to point out, people think of grocery co-ops and they tend to think of Olympia Food Co-op or Natural Foods Co-ops like PCC, but Thriftway is also a cooperative. It's those are locally owned grocery stores that are usually full service groceries, but they're able to do shared marketing like Ace Hardware through a cooperative business. And so technically you could argue that Olympia has two food co-ops in town. One is Thriftway and one is a consumer co-op, which is probably the better known one. For worker co-ops, the international definition, and can be kind of a little convoluted to think about, but it's where 50% of the workers are members of the co-op and more than 50% of the members are workers. So for instance, Orca Books is a good example in town of how that doesn't meet that definition, because there are roughly 7 workers who are members of the business, but there are about 800 consumer members. So it technically wouldn't be a worker co-op. We call those solidarity co-ops because they have different stakeholder groups. But this is kind of the example of what an international definition of a co-op. In Washington, co-ops qualify as a worker co-op as long as the majority of the board of directors are workers. And so, and have a controlling interest. And so Working Systems is one of the newer co-ops in conversions in Washington. They formed in 2018, I think. They do software. They're a software company that provides software services for labor unions. But mainly the way co-ops work is they can have a traditional hierarchy, or they can be run very collectively without a lot of hierarchy. But generally speaking, the board of directors is always present and is comprised of frontline workers. So even if there is a general manager, the manager reports to people who the general manager supervises. So it becomes kind of a helpful circle, I'd like to think, because of reflection and accountability throughout the system. So I mentioned solidarity co-ops, so that's where there's more than one stakeholder group. They used to be called multi-stakeholders. We like the term solidarity because it's not about people defending their stake. It's about people finding synergy and working together and acting in solidarity with one another. And so Connor Byrne Co-op in Seattle is a great example of this. They called us in late February and said the owner was ready to quit. He was going to close the bar March 31st, and is there any way they could save it? We said, normally we like to have 6 to 18 months to do this sort of thing, but here's what you can do. And they went out, and within 36 hours, they raised over $50,000 do the basic needs they needed to do to convince the landlord to let them have the lease, to convince the owner to sell the business to them, and to do everything else. They closed down for a few months, and then they just reopened last week with new shows. They are just an amazing example of what solidarity looks like in this sort of field. The board is generally divided between membership classifications. So there's, I think their board is like maybe 7 people. So they probably have 7 people, or they have their classifications are consumers, artists, so musicians, and workers. So their board is made up of those 3 groups. So you get all the different people that really depend on that community space coming together at the board level to think about strategy and to think about structure. And other examples include Central Co-op in Seattle, which started as a consumer co-op and then opened up membership specifically for workers. Blue Heron Bakery here in Olympia is also one that just recently converted in April, and they have I think they have like 200 or 300 consumer members and about 30 worker members. So pretty exciting. I think it's a really great example. Solidarity co-ops won't work for every situation. I think it really has to be something that has an incredible amount of consumer loyalty and also acts as, what they call a third place, right? Somewhere that is a natural community meeting space that isn't home and isn't work. It's that third space. So definitely Connor Byrne, Orchid Bookstore, a local bakery, food co-ops. Those are all great examples. And you can think about, every time you think about a business, is what, where does it fit in this, and when does consumer ownership make a good case for it. So real quickly, the legal landscape, which has been really active after decades of inactivity, it's gotten really crazy. So in Washington, we are kind of blessed. We have more laws about co-ops than I think most states that I know of. We have 4 different co-op laws. So we have the standard one, which is cooperative associations. This is considered a for-profit organization, although co-ops really operate on a cost basis, not a for-profit basis. That gets into the technicalities of how you think about that. With that is employee cooperatives. So this is where only employees can be members. You would not use this for if you wanted to do a solidarity co-op, for instance. The other one that's for-profit is the newest one, which is a limited co-op association. This allows for investor members. So this is a special class. So this would be, I think a software company is where this is going to do really well, where you need to have a lot of investors, where there maybe needs to be the investors aren't going to want to be just silent partners. They're going to want to have some voice on the board. That would be where the limited co-op association model would be probably best for. And then finally, there's one in the nonprofit world. So when co-ops really want to be nonprofit, not considered not-for-profit, again, it's all about the purpose of the organization. But the nonprofit miscellaneous and mutuals also allows for people to be considered cooperatives under that model. So really 4 different laws for whatever type of cooperative you want to have. And this has been, thriving in Washington for several years. At the national level, in 2018, things kind of got kicked off really big. 2018, as part of the $700 billion omnibus defense bill, they passed the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. They didn't include any funding, so billions for defense, but not a penny for co-ops or employee ownership. But nevertheless, this was the first employee ownership act passed by Congress in 40 years. And it directs the Small Business Administration and the Small Business Development Centers to support conversion to employee ownership. It opened up the SBA 7A loans to conversion projects, a number of other features to it, but it's largely underutilized. I think part of it is there isn't the culture within the federal government, especially the SBA or Commerce, to really understand employee ownership in that way. Employee ownership tends to live in the Labor Department at the federal level. And so it's a little bit of a mismatch, I think, personally. But nevertheless, it's a bill that's out there. It's definitely helped us. And I think the Washington SBDC to work together and find ways to work together. And it's definitely raised the bar of discussion. This then led to a bipartisan work act. I forget who the Republican sponsor was, but Bernie Sanders was the Democratic, or I guess the independent sponsor. This was called the Worker Ownership Readiness and Knowledge Act. So it passed in the omnibus bill. This one actually has $50 million to support worker ownership. This is this is over I think 5 years, so it's $10 million a year. The states have to have an employee ownership program. So Washington is one of 17 states that would qualify for this money. To give you an example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Program is $5 million a year for co-ops. And that covers all 50 states and territories of the United States. This would be $10 million a year covering just 17 states. So it's really a huge amount of money for the states that have employee ownership. The funding is approved, but because of the way Congress works, the money has not been appropriated yet. It is supposed to be appropriated in the upcoming budget, but as we know lately, budgets have a very different process and how they get handled at Congress these days. And so we're hoping, and obviously people are trying to make sure that this work act, which was bipartisan, will get its true funding, and we'll be able to start seeing this money come to the states in the next future, in the near future. So then in Washington, Senator Patton from Spokane Valley introduced the Washington Employee Ownership Act in January of 2023. That was 2 days after I took over as co-executive director of NWCDC. So it was definitely a welcome to your job moment. It managed to pass unanimously on its first run through the legislature. It passed every committee unanimously as well. It was absolutely a bipartisan effort. It went into law on July 23rd. There are 4 major aspects, which I'll talk about in a second. And then one, which I really think is important, which is annual monitoring and reporting on the overall impact of employee ownership. One of the issues we're finding on the commission now is how do you actually find employee-owned businesses? Even within the co-op world, it really means having to go through and look at individual organizations piece by piece. ESOPs, again, are not registered as ESOPs by the state. But they have a trade association, and trusts are even more complicated. So it's definitely going to be some work for Commerce to figure it out in that report. But once we get it, it's going to be, I think, an amazing report for people to have. The other aspects of the law creates an ownership program within the State Department of Commerce. And Commerce has a lot of experience with housing cooperatives already, so this is not alien to, unlike at the federal level. I think the State Department of Commerce has a culture within it already of understanding the cooperative model. It's appointed commission to oversee the project and help draft acts and do other things. The big thing, though, is a tax credit. So for ESOPs, they get up to $100,000, which makes 50% of the B&O tax, and co-ops up to $25,000, capped at $2 million a year. So this means when a co-op, when a business converts to either ESOP or cooperative ownership, they can reduce their B&O tax by up to these limits to cover the costs of conversion. That would be attorney fees, accounting fees, other fees, including technical assistance, support, etc. So this is a really big push to give a starting hand to these new converted businesses. It also creates a revolving loan fund with no personal guarantee. This is unlike the SBA 7A loan. So we really try to push back against personal guarantees, and it really creates an unfair burden within the organization. And but of course, there needs to be funding for that. That's where we hope the Work Act will come in. Also, the State Small Business Credit Initiative might be some other funding, but definitely be one of the things will be funding that revolving loan fund in the future. These are the commission members. Like I said, Joey Nestegard with Schweitzer is chair. I have vice chair, and then as you can see, it's a pretty good representation of our community right now. We have ESOP attorneys and also people from the academic sector and financial center like Mike Seo. So yeah, I mentioned the tax credit has gone into effect. There's some new rules around it. It's pretty simple to apply for the tax credit. The funding is still needed for the revolving loan fund. We're in the process of creating WACs and then identifying the employee-owned businesses. On the other side of that is the Washington Center for Employee Ownership. This has been in formation since 2020, and the new law kind of went faster than they did. But there is going to be more of a clearinghouse model, helping do training for capacity and engaging the government, also being a resource. It's modeled after several other employee centers for employee ownership across the country. They are currently hiring. We're currently hiring the first executive director, and looking forward to that going on as well. And then finally, just recently this year, Ro Khanna from in Congress introduced the National Worker Co-op Development Act. This would even give more benefits. It would actually eliminate capital gains tax on the sale of a business to their employees. It also creates sort of a solidarity fund to help fund these revolving loan funds from existing co-ops. And then it provides technical assistance support as well. Currently, unfortunately, it was introduced without any GOP sponsors. These bills work best when they're bipartisan, and but hopefully it'll start gaining some legs. I think there's some really great things in this act, and it would definitely really provide a lot of incentives for business owners to see their employees as potential purchasers of the business. So our changes, I just say, we revamped our website. We actually created a whole new position just to go out and find willing sellers. So we're now, in the past, we've always waited for people to come to us. Now we're actually going out to seek business owners, definitely promoting the new law and working with community partners to support conversions. So we are always happy if you have clients that are thinking about it. We are always happy to come in to provide information and basic support. And one of the things we can do is work where we're experts at, which is helping in governance and training up the employees, and partner with organizations where they're really good at too. And so we can always find ways to do partnerships. And yeah, there's never been a better time for employee ownership in Washington. And yeah, I put some documents in the chat, and yeah, if there are any questions or discussion, I'm always happy to answer questions.
Fabulous. How many of you knew we were so far beyond anywhere else? I mean, this is really, really exciting. I have a bunch of questions, but I want to open it up to folks in the room. It looks like we have 50, or we had 50. Anyone have specific questions for John McNamara?
And you can just unmute yourself or put your question in the chat. Lisa, why don't you go ahead, and maybe
Sure.
that'll spark some.
So, John, one of the things you said, I mean, I was going to ask, well, how many cooperatives are there? How many employee-owned companies are there in Washington, and that we can't track or haven't been able to track is interesting. Do you think the state will have some kind of policy to ensure folks get recorded or registered, or be able to track that more effectively, because data is king?
Right. I know Lorena is here, and she's one of the staff people for the commission, so she might actually be able to answer that better. But we are looking at that. We're trying to figure out ways to do that. Part of it might be trying to do a census. Part of it might be working with Department of Revenue to try to capture that information at tax time. Worker co-ops are relatively easier because we know a lot of them, or most of them. There's probably about 20 to 30 co-ops right now. Some of them don't use the law. They might be under different laws and stuff. So, but they wouldn't necessarily qualify as under the law for benefits, but they would still be employee owned. So I think it's going to be some really important work for us to do, because I think when you start pulling in the Schweitzers and the Wincos and things like that, you're going to see an economic landscape in Washington where worker employee ownership is going to be as important as some of the big fish names that are associated with Washington's economy.
Wonderful, wonderful. I also wanted to say that way back in the day, WSMA hosted a webinar in the middle of the pandemic with the folks from the Democracy Collaborative and your organization that was really informative, just to help raise awareness about the power of cooperatives. Oh, thank you, Cherie, for putting that link in there. And can you share a little bit about, I mean, we see these big companies, but I also know of a lot of little tiny micro enterprise size cooperatives. And is the commission going to look at them at all or support them, or how does that play in the scheme of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is supporting at whatever size. I mean, some of our organizations have, I think, like Dumpster Values in Olympia is 3 people, maybe they're going up to 5. We're actually known as an organization that works with micro enterprises. Some of the other people doing co-op work nationally, they ask me, how do you work with groups with under 10 workers? It's like, well, it's you just do. It's actually is not much different than working with a larger group, but
Love
so
it.
I think it's trying to just I think identifying and probably between the state commission and the center is finding what those special needs are and being able to build programming around it and information around it.
Wonderful. Jessica had a question here. She said, excellent presentation. It was mentioned earlier that entities don't convert to ESOPs, but adopt it. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, that was something one of the attorneys on the commission pointed out, because the law language is about converting to employee ownership, and he pointed out, and this is, I mean, what lawyers do, they lawyer, and he pointed out that, so if you're already an S corp, you might become an ESOP, but you still are an S corp. And so it's just you're bringing in the plan as part of the ownership. So the ESOPs can either have 100% ownership or a percentage of that as part of the plan. And so they aren't really by themselves a corporation. They're a plan that sits on top of another corporation. Generally, they're going to be part of a C corp, but they can also be an S corp. They might even be able to be LLCs. I'm not as sure about that, though.
You also mentioned that there's a fund available for businesses to get 100,000. I can't remember exactly the term. If they convert or adopt an ESOP. And I also thought I understood they also get a tax break. Like, so if 30% of the employees convert, then they get 30% of a tax break on their taxes. Is that the same thing that you were referring to with the B&O tax?
Well, yes. So the tax break is the B&O taxes, the tax credit. That's for the law. So if once conversion happens, they can deduct their costs up to 50% of their B&O tax to cover the costs of conversion. Conversion costs tend to be a lot higher in ESOPs than in co-ops, just because of the regulation that is around them, because they are a retirement plan. There are other, of course, benefits. I mean, ESOPs, as a rule, as I understand it, don't really pay federal tax on their profit.
Yeah,
and,
that's what.
Right.
That's the part that I think companies really need to understand, is that if they were, depending on the percentage of the company that converts to employee ownership, it's that percentage that they have tax relief.
Right.
I mean, are you hearing me? This is huge.
Yeah. So it can really make the even a business that is struggling as it currently is, once it converts over to employee ownership, there are things in place to make it more productive. And then, as a rule, we also see a big rise in productivity after the sale. Like Working Systems, for instance, had almost an immediate 20% increase in productivity and billing hours after their conversion. And
Because
that's
they were
just,
so happy. I'm
yeah,
just
they're,
kidding.
you know,
That
the
was a
work,
joke.
the workers, I mean, I think it's because, you know, the workers, you know, suddenly it's theirs, and it just, you know, whatever psychological switch happens, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for that switch to kick over, but definitely we see it.
Wonderful. James Davis from KEDA there in Kitsap County had a question. How does the new beneficial ownership law affect co-ops and ESOPs currently?
Well, currently, I mean, I think we're still
Or
writing.
current ones, yeah.
Yeah, we're still writing rules. I think down the line, you know, as we see more the program develop, we'll be able to go back and tinker with other benefits and rules. I mean, for now, right now, I would say there's having more of them is going to help everybody. They'll be more noticeable. There's definitely organizations. We've helped set up 3 regional organizations in Washington, Cascade Co-ops in Bellingham, Olympic Co-op Network on the peninsula, and South Sound here in Thurston County, that are basically trade associations of cooperatives, and they're doing joint marketing together. They're making themselves visible, and trying to keep that money within the cooperative community. So, you know, seeing where they can do trade with
John,
each.
it's actually more geared around the FinCEN law. About beneficial ownership. I was just wondering if that, you know, you mentioned earlier that co-ops are corporations, and you know, obviously they are, right? And ESOPs are as well. And is there some nuanced requirement as a part of this new law from FinCEN?
Not that we know of. The big thing about the FinCEN law, the Corporate Transparency Act, is people, you know, the co-ops do have to figure out who has to register, right? So not everybody has to register, but usually it's going to be probably officers and maybe the general manager, because no one really has the ownership stake to be a majority owner in a co-op, so that we're still working that out. But from the attorneys we've talked to, it seems like as officers are the key people that need to register for that. And then people that do incorporation. So if you incorporate organizations like I tend to do, I had to get a FinCEN number.
Okay, that's good to know. I was thinking here that, you know, multiple employees would be suddenly thrust into the beneficial ownership side of things. So if they're delineating it based on a majority stake, then
yeah, it is one of the challenges, and definitely something we are thinking, or at least I'm thinking about, is you know, like for instance, access for home care agencies to access Apple Care, they need to identify all their owners and with background checks and stuff, and it's like, well, that's just not a realistic thing for us to do for getting access to that other companies, you know, they don't have to list all their employees. Also, you know, definitely one of the other challenges I think that has to be addressed is for businesses that currently are able to register as minority women-owned enterprises, that we need probably something similar for employee ownership so that you don't lose that benefit at conversion. Because again, being a C Corp, it's pretty hard to qualify as a MWE. So those are some other challenges.
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I have another question, and WSMA has been working with you folks for many, many years. And we're fortunate to have been able to fund some of these innovative programs, one of which was way back in the day in like 2018, maybe, or 19. And it stemmed out of this reality that many of us in our communities have these long-standing 25-year-old companies that are manufacturers of products that have been there forever, and they just don't have a succession plan, and they close, which all these employees and the community just really suffers. And so we worked with you and the SBDCs to develop a series of videos to help SBDC partners really have that on the tip of their tongue when they're talking to maybe a company or a business owner that's ready to retire, ready to fold their business as an alternative. So I'm curious about one, I don't know, Steve, if you want to speak to that, but how can we have our eyes peeled for those companies that are maybe ideal for that conversion or that, you know, that transition? And how do we raise awareness among all of these business resource partners about the power of cooperatives, the resources that you're providing, and other opportunities afoot?
Lisa, we're looking at this every day. And in fact, I just had somebody that I worked with 13 years ago come to me and say, I want to sell to my employees. And so I'll be meeting with her relative to that. So this is just one of those things that we cover. We've had John recently talk to our organization. But I also wanted to call up, and she will not realize that I'm going to call on her, but Lorena Lowell, who was an SBDC advisor at the beginning of this year, managed to get taken away from us by the Washington State Department of Commerce in order to be able to further develop this program within commerce. And I'd love to give her an opportunity to really answer your question, Lisa, about how commerce is beginning to address this as well.
I agree. Go for it.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Stephen, for putting me on the spot. And thank you, John, for that amazing presentation. Well, we're building up the program. You know, I've been working on it from there was nothing when I came in. So we're building out the program, and a big portion of the program, and the next step is the technical assistant. And of course, creating partnerships within the state with statewide and nationwide organizations to be able to do outreach, just kind of partner with people to do some technical assistance, share resources. There's amazing companies. There's a lot of resources. And right now, part of my puzzle is to kind of figure out the best way to start going out there. As John mentioned, one of the biggest challenges is that nationwide, there is not an accurate way to be able to create a repository of the ESOPs, EOPs, or trusts and are in the state or in the country. And there's not, because they're not mandated to register with any agency. So that's a challenge for us to kind of reach out to all the current ESOPs and start, distributing information from there. But we're working with different agencies, brainstorming with the U.S. Department of Labor and IRS to cover that portion. But specifically for the outreach, we are just kind of developing our communication plan, our communication strategy, and probably in the next quarter, we will be more visible as of the tools and resources. Right now, we're focusing on building, we're writing the grants, the WACs. So we're doing all the groundwork, the legal part of the operation of the program. So be a little patient with us, but we're working on it.
That's great, Lorena. Thank you so much for being here and for the work you do. Go for it, John.
Of course, thank you.
One thing I do want to say when you're talking to clients, something that needs to be just said about there for converting to employee ownership is that the business has to be able to be sold. We're not going to, this isn't a pathway to take a failing business and manage to, help somebody get out from under a failing business. It doesn't have to be a perfect business, but it does need to have a pathway to being able to break even after conversion. And there needs to be, it needs to have, the books need to be in shape. We can't, if you have to spend a year or two trying to get the books to be where they're readable, this business probably isn't going to convert, and it's probably not going to sell to anyone. And I think those are just some of the things that need to be said. Sometimes we do get businesses where either the market's completely disappeared because of cultural changes or technology, or the owner just says, businesses slow down with their owners. And so, and they just haven't been doing the books. I can share that Blue Heron was actually in a place where it probably took them about a year to get the books in shape before they were able to, but they were a thriving enough business that they were able to do that. And so definitely that's just something to be thinking about is if they wouldn't be able to present a viable business to a third party for a sale, then they probably won't be able to do that to their employees either.
So if or when anybody in this room hears about, thinks about, knows about a business that may want to become an ESOP, or a bunch of microenterprises that want to grow into or develop a cooperative, would it best be to contact the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, but also SBDCs?
Right.
You are all experts in the state. And I don't know if anyone else has a comment, but we are getting close. I have 2 more questions, but anyone else have a question for John before we let him go? Okay. My question is about sociocracy. This is one of the coolest ways of managing organizations and problem solving and decision making. It's really incredible. And I wanted to know if you'd give us a thumbnail or a pin, about sociocracy.
Yeah, so sociocracy was developed years ago, and I forget the name of the folks, but it's basically a way of running an organization in which people consent to the work that they do. And so it's done by creating circles of work that they sometimes say, rather than having a hierarchy of power, it's a hierarchy of work. So different people in similar work areas, and then those circles are linked to each other in a way that has communication paths that go up and down the system. And then, it's very interestingly, the people that created the construct of sociocracy years ago did not believe that it would work with co-ops for some reason. But it's basically a very flattened hierarchy in which people have voice in their organization. They help design the work, and they help share that information throughout the system. So it's kind of based on double linking circles of work, consent versus consensus. So people actually consent to what they decide to do, and then rather than people showing up with proposals, you share that information and problem solve together. It can be really incredible when it's working fine-tuned, and it can be just as messy as any other form when it's not. But Blue Heron is a really good example of a co-op right now that's using sociocracy. We're seeing more people turn to it. It's definitely a really good, even if you're not a cooperative, it can be a great way of really valuing the humans in your workplace and helping them feel appreciated and respected as well.
Thank you for that thumbnail sketch. I'll also say I've been in a few circles of my own, and that model created such a level of ownership, that humans' ownership of that process of decision making, of their role. It was just quite incredible. So thank you for that. And thank you, Lorena, for putting your contact information in there. Any other questions before we say goodbye? Okay, beautiful job, John, as per usual.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Lisa and Cherie and Lorena, for being with us and for all your work on this really inspiring business model that is, cutting edge for the whole country, and nonpartisan support on both sides of the aisle. Just really, really cool stuff. So congratulations for getting us to this point. And I hope all of you will explore this. You don't have to be an expert, but now you know where to turn as you're talking with businesses who are looking to revitalize or grow. With that, we are adjourned for